I grew up thinking the strength of music was how it didn't need words to communicate, and how it spoke beyond language. As a composer, for many years I thought my writing withheld no extra musical meaning, and that it conveyed nothing but the music and the personal emotions evoked. Boy, was I wrong. The neoclassicists were even more strict. They believed music didn't convey anything at all, not even emotions. Igor Stravinsky observed, "I consider that music is, by its very nature, essentially powerless to express anything at all, whether a feeling, an attitude of mind, a psychological mood, a phenomenon of nature, etc. Expression has never been an inherent property of music." While it is true that much of music's power relies on the fact it cannot objectively mean anything like words do, it is dangerous to affirm that they have no absolute meaning beyond themselves. Genres, for instance, already convey different contexts. A piece by Mozart could convey elegance, playfulness, and wealth, while a German punk song could convey rebellion, rawness, and anger. Maybe in the future these two will sound more similar than they do now, but I bet if you showed both to whatever human from the beginning of human history to the present day and asked them to tie these terms to music, most results would pretty much crush the neoclassicist belief. Obviously, film composers have a pretty opposite belief from them, while sometimes the juxtaposition of opposites can create new original emotions, like in the ending scene of Obsession, or when the explosion in Oppenheimer is accompanied by the biggest silence ever.
2, 1.
Film composers often prefer to strengthen the emotion of the scene, and, in order to do so, they must form a toolbox throughout their years of experience by having a good knowledge of movie soundtrack literature and what has been used to convey what emotions and to score scenes. What are the music narrative tools, basically? Now, considering this is necessary and all movie composers know that, what really makes a difference between a good composer and a great one? When you're scrolling on Netflix through countless movies, what makes you instantly distinguish the A tier from the B tier ones? Actors, photography, awards? Well, in my opinion, that happens in soundtracks too. And what differentiates an A-tier soundtrack is, fundamentally, the mastery of tropes. Quick note, I know this is almost an hour long, so if you'd like a summary of everything we cover in this video before watching to be sure it interests you, there's a quick recap at the end, okay? First of all, let's read the proper definition of what a trope is. A common theme or device, as in the arts. Motif. A simple definition might be, a trope is a recurring narrative device, character type, situation, or theme that audiences recognize because it appears repeatedly across stories. Now, what I really want to focus on is the difference between it and a cliché. The Merriam-Webster definition of cliché is a trite phrase or expression, also an idea, style, or action that has become overly familiar or commonplace. The Cambridge Dictionary definition makes an even clearer point, a saying or remark that is very often made and is therefore not original and not interesting. Now, as composers, how do we avoid the cliché? How to respect the tradition that has come before us without sounding unoriginal? Especially considering that now, more than all times, soundtracks must be minimal and as unobtrusive as possible in the movie. How do we make original choices without sounding showy? Author Christopher Booker can help us. He stated, "There are only a small number of stories in the world. Originality lies in how they are told." And that is true for us too, just in a different way. Stay with me, I'll explain it later. Now let's dive into the difference between a trope and a cliché. Just this week I saw the trailer for Other Mommy on YouTube, and the first comment said, "I'm so glad the dad saw The Other Mommy, so it's not just a tired trope where the girl is trying to tell her parents about the entity and them not believing her. Here, instead of tired trope, one could have perfectly used the word cliché. This is a perfect example to understand the difference. A trope is exactly something that has not been overused, unlike the example in here, which has eventually become a cliché. You could say that every cliché is built from a trope, but not every trope is a cliché. Ultimately, a trope is a tool, while a cliché is the result of using that tool without originality or purpose. I believe the confusion is born from the fact that there are three shades for these narrative tools and only two terms. You have tropes that cannot become overused because they are not tied to technicalities and therefore cannot age. Tropes that are still tropes because they still haven't been used enough in pop culture to become clichés, like when 20 years ago the trope described before still didn't feel overused, but potentially can become clichés. Clichés which are tropes that have aged and become obsolete. In the end, what we have is two categories really: tropes that can't age and tropes that can and eventually will age. Both are really good. The trick is to recognize them and use the second ones when they still haven't aged. I believe that to put an end to all of this confusion, we must fully integrate a third term that has already been overused in narrative, but still didn't take the root like the other two: the archetype. First of all, let's define what an archetype is. I could quote you Jung, but I found Campbell's definition to be far more appropriate for our purpose. He says, archetypes are universal symbolic patterns that recur in myths because they represent fundamental stages and forces of human psychological development. Now, that's interesting. It's the third layer, and just for you to be sure, it's not a random thing, but something Hollywood is truly aware of. Just look at how many roles Matt Damon has portrayed which have the same archetypal trope: the man who wants to go back home. Now, this is clearly a trope that belongs to the archetype category, as it still didn't get old after almost 3,000 years. Therefore, we can affirm tropes are either archetypes or will eventually become clichés. The nerdy guy in hacking everything in heist movies was interesting at first, but got old because it's tied to a technicality and not an ancient symbolic pattern. That's the big difference. And now finally back to movie scoring. What is an archetype, a trope, and a cliché in music? Before we do that, let's clarify that talking about musical archetypes, which are musical narrative tools, implies that we are talking about the relationship between musical and extra musical elements. Personally, I have found that archetypes in music can range from relationships with very simple materials to quite complex ones. You know the basics. Major means happy, minor means sad, dissonances create tension. You can have something less simple, like the association of two things together. Fast percussion that accelerates creates tension, low strings suggest evil, and all of that. But all of this is still a very basic level association. And then I stumbled upon a very curious archetype, which appeared throughout several different contexts. I called it the childhood archetype. I'll show you 3 pieces of music that share it.
Não, não fuja não, finja que agora eu era o seu brinquedo, eu era o seu peão, o seu bicho preferido.
Fuss and hard work for the worlds that create them for us. Well, you see now, quite simply that's all that they do, making one unique holiday especially for you. But once a calamity ever so great occurred when 2 holidays met by mistake.
Hear this song and remember, soon you'll be.
There are several musical elements that create this idea. Minor tonality, melody starting on the 5, going to the flat 6, and then back to the 5, triple meter. Now, I don't know if I've missed all the other elements shared between these 3 pieces of music, but it's amazing that all of them talk about childhood, and not just any childhood. There's always a sense of magic or nostalgia involved, especially in the Shikubuaki song and in Anastasia. They both talk about some sort of lost childhood. And I'm not even focusing on the instrumentation choice, which, since obviously Glockenspiel and Celesta are almost a cliché for childhood. So, isn't that curious? Honestly, I tell you this. The more simple or the more complex a musical narrative tool is, the more I tell you it's an archetype. The more in the center, the more it risks becoming a cliché. Because you see, like we'll never give up the homecoming trope, we'll probably never start feeling minor tonalities that sound as joyful and major as dreadful. Maybe the childhood archetype we just talked about could eventually become obsolete, a cliché, because the musical aspects it is tied to are very technical and very based on a Western idea of what childhood should sound like. Now that we've got all of that out of the way, we can move on. What you probably wanted to know from this video is, how do I distinguish an archetype from a cliché? How do I use that in a movie? I'm gonna start by saying that musically, the difference is really subtle. I think most of the problem all artists deal with is, how do I make something original and yet familiar? Well, maybe not for all artists, but at least for musicians there's surely this, especially film composers. When you have so much literacy about film scoring, and even before films with other types of musical narrative in Renaissance or Patent and opera, it definitely feels hard to switch from what's been used to something different. How are you supposed to maintain the archetype and be original? At this point, you probably want to beat me up, but to explain this, we'll have to dive into an hybrid example that's not merely musical, but in between music and narrative, intertwining the two to create an interesting rupture from the archetype, or rather, a subversion. I chose that because I feel it's a perfect example that uses a musical archetype to build the story actively, so it's within the screenplay. It's such a clear musical archetype that Nolan, who isn't a musician, knew it would work, and that audiences, whatever their background, would have the reaction triggered by it. You get an orchestra tuning their instruments. That happens at the beginning of concerts and has developed this feeling of unconventional overture. Not the overture composers wrote, but the overture every concert had as an opening, simply out of necessity. Nolan used this energy built up throughout the centuries of concerts from the orchestra tuning just to break it with a surprise in the beginning of the movie. Like a guitar is out of context in an orchestra, so is a shotgun. That's the trick about using archetypes and not being annoying, not feeling like a washed up cliché. Subversion, a proper one, which is done by subverting one or more of the very basic principles of the musical archetype you are using. And it must be subverted with a reason behind it. It just wouldn't be good enough if you were to subvert something random. The unconventional choice must carry meaning, or it's just weirdness for the sake of originality, which is not how being original works, obviously. Take Oppenheimer's theme, for instance. It came from the idea of a musician practicing, so something that sounds like a musical exercise, repeating over and over to achieve perfection. Now, how many times have you seen these characteristics in a movie theme? Almost never, I bet. Usually you want a melody that's memorable, with classic phrasing, as you want it to be versatile enough to match the mood and be able to be recognizable throughout the score in different settings and tonalities that are going to be needed. If you think about it then, Ludwig's idea should be terrible. His theme relies on the repetition of a pattern of notes that doesn't change in rhythmic values and relies on constant tempo changes for its variation, which means the accelerando is a central characteristic to his theme. That'd be bonkers even only 20 years ago. That's where I think Ludwig's greatness lies. He's not afraid of making other unconventional musical elements the core of thematic strength. Tools like tempo changes and scalar phrases were always used as narrative devices to accompany the pace and tone of the scene, rather than thematic elements. That's the secret for most modern soundscapes, crafting themes with more than what we're used to. Think about how Daniel Pemberton does his Spider-Man scores too. How often did composers rely on using not just the same instrument, but the same exact sound, oftentimes in the same pitch and tonality, for a character's theme in narrative? And that movie score has no business feeling this rich and dynamic, not even close to boring or repetitive as it should have been. Now you're gonna be asking me, what does that have to do with subverting archetypes and doing it meaningfully? Everything. Why did Ludwig incorporate those characteristics into the theme? Why did he let those be the backbone driving the movie? Because of the relationship those musical elements have with extra musical elements. In a certain way, you could say, because of their archetypal meaning. Through repetition, centuries of musical practice, music exercises have developed this evolving sound. As Ludwig says,
It's almost like an exercise. It's a very simple pattern, and you just go up the scale, the 6-note scale, and then you go down again.
he invested in finding a way of making something like that sound original and thematic rather than just creating an exercise-like accompaniment and then investing the thematic elements in the usual theme. You can see even more old-school composers are shifting towards this way, like Michael Giacchino in The Batman. You definitely still have a theme and all of that, but the simple motivic cell he took from Nirvana's Some Things in the Way is far from his Up theme. And yet is decisively the most iconic bit of music from The Batman, a bit that we all remember. What's most interesting is how both Nolan's usage of the archetypal meaning of the orchestra tuning in Tenet's opening and Ludwig's usage of the archetypal meaning of musical exercises come from non-conventionally musical material. They use stuff which is not conventionally thought of as music to acquire a narrative meaning. You've heard dramatic violin melodies used 1,000 times to portray something meaningful. You have seen lots of distorted guitars to portray rage. But there is so much meaning behind sound that is left completely unexplored because of how it is conventionally thought of as non-musical, or even worse, non-meaningful. Paradoxically, because of this phenomenon, these kinds of sounds have built a much stronger and fresh and untouched archetypal meaning than what naturally has a gravity towards meaning and is thought of as naturally meaningful in music. And now let's finally talk about what we wanted to know from the beginning of the video. Once you found an archetype, how to know how it must be twisted each time? That's where the brilliance at. It's completely up to you. But we can take some examples from Ludwig's music to understand how the process behind finding those subversions might be, and what elements are not conventionally thematic and can be explored in that way to create something new. First of all, to find an element that's not conventionally thematic, you must know what's very conventionally thematic. In an NFTS online masterclass I recently had, I've learned how it's a melody with these characteristics. It's singable, it has motivic cells, and has an interesting contour. Now that you know that, the next step is probably understanding what is conventionally avoided when writing themes, which is what you will include in the basic version of your theme. That is exactly what you're going to pursue in your theme. Most of those elements are what's conventionally used to shift your theme to match the scene. That is, tonality changes, tempo changes, more SFX like sonorities, accompaniment patterns, and so on. The list here could go very long, but you got the gist of it. After that, you must understand what's the strength behind themes that goes beyond what's conventionally thematic. Remember when I started Brooks' sentence, there are only a small number of stories in the world. Originality lies in how they are told. Well, in music, I believe this is true in the sense that no matter the context, certain elements will still convey certain ideas. Risers will convey rising tension, no matter if it's in a late night club or in the Odyssey score. Low rumbles will evoke fear. Doesn't matter if it's in the cinemas or in the wild 10,000 years ago. Obviously the stakes change, but certain things are a universal experience. A child will feel thunder no matter where they are from. In scores, if you want to know what's at the essence of what's thematic, beyond conventionality, that is the idea of identity. In that same masterclass, I also learned that what separates a melody from a theme is, ultimately, the fact it represents another idea. So if your musical idea, whatever the elements that make it up are, can be recognized and utilized throughout several contexts, and sometimes that might even not be necessary, then you have a theme. If it portrays properly what it is meant to convey and works as a unity doing so, then you have it. In Tenet, for example, Ludwig has several themes that don't have any melodic value. It's a sound with a rhythm and it can be just enough. Sometimes even a technique or a voicing can be recognizable and thematic, which is even the way of structuring your phrases could be. Doing phrases with 2 questions and an answer, whatever, have fun with it. Just make sure you get what's original about it and why it makes sense that it's portraying what it's meant to be portraying. Finally, the last step of brilliance you need is, how do I achieve a compelling soundtrack while using these unconventional themes as the backbone for my story? This is without taking into account the infinite steps throughout the journey of a composer, such as maintaining a coherence in the soundscape of the movie, reflecting conflicts musically, conveying emotions, and perhaps maintaining an identity as a composer while doing all of that. So yeah, hard job, but that's why Ludwig is Ludwig. Now that we've said all of that, let's dive a little bit into what you've been waiting for: the music of the Odyssey. First of all, like all Ludwig Göransson scores, the Odyssey score is very textural. Ludwig stated, "My approach is to build sounds from the ground up that allows the music to function more in a way that traditional sound design functions in a film where it's very subliminal." Directions from Nolan already helped in this part of the process.
The first conversation we had was Chris telling me that he wanted something completely unique for this film. No orchestra, no familiar sounds that you've heard before in a movie like this.
We wanted the film to feel like a recognizable world to people, even though it was going to be ancient Greece. We don't want it to look and feel like previous movies that take on this kind of classical world. What can we do that's more timeless than that?
The instrumentation was very interesting, more specifically as it was tailored to the movie more than in any of Ludwig's previous works. Now, let's go through some tracks. We're gonna start from the first track. Let's do a little game. Out of the instruments in this list, which one do you think is more appropriate to open a movie with? I know it depends a lot on the scene, but if you had to choose which of them has the most overture archetypal energy, which one would it be? Here's the answer. If you didn't get it right, don't worry, because it really depends on the scene. If the movie opened with a fight, it would probably have been the percussion, and if it opened with a pastoral landscape, it might have been the lyre, the aloes, or the vocals as well. But think about it, the gongs have this ancient, evocative sonority. Would you use it in the middle of a symphony? Unless the structure is very unconventional, probably not. You'd use it in a moment that is important for the structures, such as the end or the beginning. What's really interesting about understanding the archetypal meaning of instruments is that it's not a very musical process, but practical and perhaps more obvious for a non-musician who, in their ignorance, sees the huge gongs and instantly knows it's meant for a big thing, while the composer might be answering 1,000 questions and not asking the most important, simple ones. That's a first example of how you can approach archetypal meaning. In what context is that music found? It's the same process Hans Zimmer pointed out about Star Wars when writing Interstellar. Why would the music in space sound like romantic music from the 1800s? That's what Nolan saw. He wanted to sound closer to what would have been the music in the actual setting. Let's keep going with our next track. This is played as we see Telemachus training, his blind mentor guiding him. Not only having these instruments being so central to the score is uncommon, but what's more surprising is the theme being very simple, mixing a short 4-note theme, sometimes only played partially, and a harmonic progression following, starting on the 4th note. Variations of this are heard throughout the entire score, as a recurring callback home, which is the idea that was meant to be portrayed in this track. These callbacks become a powerful call toward home, and I can't stress enough how brilliant it is to have it this simple. Doesn't it feel like home? This is the kind of stuff where you just have to explore soundscapes until you find something that hits profoundly anyone that listens to it. These flutes in the beginning feel like tradition, nature, homeland, far from the cities and the caves. Another remarkable thing about this track is how once again Nolan acknowledged the power of music, as he definitely included in the screenplay that those bowstring twangs would have been portrayed in the score. And that's the dopest shit ever. We could be here talking for a long time about several other incredible tracks like Penelope, Circe, Hades, don't know how to pronounce, Odysseus, but I'll end with 2 of my personal favorites. Here, I want you to notice how simple the theme is. The theme first appears in the track Penelope, while Odysseus asks her to promise she will remarry if he doesn't return. She refuses to, and asks him to promise to return, to which he answers, "And what if I couldn't?" Ultimately, the monologue about the siren's chant makes clear why this theme appears over the siren's chant, to accompany the feeling of Odysseus. He says, "It's all things you wanted to be, then all the things you wish you never wished for." And then he goes on saying it's like an irresistible itch you cannot reach, convincing you that what you most desire is what you cannot have, and that what you cannot have the most is what you already had and lost. I think this is a great example because it's the most obvious choice of scoring, a callback to his promises. And it plays again when he reunites with Penelope. Simple and effective if you stop to think about what's original about this theme, besides the timbre, which is perfect for the longing aspect of its expressive sound. It's very peculiar stuff. The fact the last note of each of these groupings of 4 notes goes from 2 voices to unison, which has this very interesting effect that's actually the most avoided in conventional voice leading. The fact Ludwig left the pause the players uses to breathe in the score instead of editing with a computer. All of these are very risky choices, as they could take you out of the narrative, but they don't. And now, last but not least, let's go with the bomb. I won't talk much about this piece as it speaks for itself. The most brilliant part is how the 4-note theme is played first with 2 notes, then 3, and then finally 4, with the last note hitting as Odysseus plucks the bowstring. This is a clever build-up to that moment, since for all of the score we've been hearing this theme several times playing on the lyre. It instantly creates this expectation for when he'll finally string the bow. And you see, I think this kind of idea is also very risky. But as you probably could see in this video, the risky ideas are the ones that really pay off if you work long enough on it to make it work. From building Oppenheimer's theme around the idea of a musical exercise to sidechaining an orchestra, Ludwig is a composer that takes risks. It doesn't write anything too complex harmonically, melodically, but the layering of motifs and how they are instantly glued to the themes of the movie is what really makes it work. This is what understanding a trope is about, knowing that you can't come in and use a clown hall to portray sadness because it is ridiculous. Many, when trying to be original, would get somewhere closer to using a clown horn, trust me. Weirdness for the sake of originality, as I said. But good movie composers, they would rather be unoriginal than to destroy the narrative. So when you write or listen to a score next time, ask yourself this question. What ideas does this music naturally convey? What imagery does it evoke? What is its archetypal meaning? So let's quickly recap what we've talked about in this video. Music isn't a blank language. While it rarely has objective meanings like words do, it constantly builds associations with ideas, emotions, places, and stories. Those associations become musical narrative tools or tropes. Some are temporary and eventually become cliches. Others are rooted in universal symbolic patterns. Those are archetypes. Great film composers do not ignore archetypes, they rely on them. The trick is knowing which conventions to preserve and which ones to subvert. And the most interesting subversions often do come from reinventing melody and harmony, but from making unconventional musical elements carry the thematic identity of the score. You could have tempo, timbre, texture, performance, techniques, even sounds that traditionally weren't considered musical. Ultimately, originality isn't about avoiding tradition. It's about understanding why musical ideas carry meaning in the first place, and then finding a new way to express that meaning. And that's all for today. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I know this ended up being a rather long video, but I hope it gave you a different perspective on the way music tells stories, and why some soundtracks stay with us long after the movie is over. One last thing before you go, I don't monetize my videos. I prefer keeping them free from ads, so if you'd like to support the time, research and work that goes into making these essays, you can do so through my Ko-Fi page. Ko-Fi, I don't know the pronouns. There's absolutely no obligation. Watching, commenting and sharing the video already helps more than you might think. But if you'd like to contribute, you'll find a link in the description. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.